Hello, I'm Ken Christensen. Today I'd like to share with you just a portion of my library. And like all collectors, we end up specializing in subjects that are dear to our heart. I have several areas like that. They are in no way related, but they kind of reflect my personal interests. And one that goes way back to, I guess, my early 20s I got started, and that is books by used booksellers. And generally when you're searching for titles like this or similarly related things, in used bookstores they'll come under the title Books on Books, which sounds like kind of a very, very odd subject matter and not a particular interest, but there are gems within that, and I'm going to show you a few examples today. I'm going to show you the book that got me started in this kind of an odd topic category. And that is one that was given to me as a gift when I was, 21 years old, attending the University of Manchester in Manchester, England. And I lived in a sort of, I guess you could call it a suburb, a village area adjoining Manchester called Withington. And just to the south of that was a neighborhood called Didsbury. And in Didsbury, there was a used bookstore called Morton's. It still exists, somewhat different nowadays. The descendants have taken it over from the men that I originally knew, and they were two brothers. Couldn't have been further apart different-wise. It was the tall, skinny one, kind of dry and acerbic, and there was the fat, jovial one. Both were very nice, but I kind of learned the fat, jovial brother gave much better prices and was very generous. Eventually, I became friendlier with him, and he invited me to his home and befriended me in many ways. And one of them was I showed interest in books and book collecting, and he gave me this one particular book. It's a small book, Bits from an Old Bookshop by R.M. Williamson, cost 6p net, and I think the date is run around 1906, 1904. And what charmed me, this is an autobiography written by a used bookseller, and his chapters are The Pleasures of Bookselling, How I Became a Bookseller, Lovers of Books, Amenities of Book Buying, The Value of Old Books, The Gentle Art of Book Hunting, etc., etc. And he describes what it's like to be a bookseller. He says, "Buying and selling old books is a most delightful occupation. Let poets sing of the pleasures of hope, the pleasures of the imagination, the pleasures of memory, or essayists write of the pleasures of literature. 'Tis mine to praise the pleasures of bookselling." Well, these were words dear to my heart. And he goes on in much the same vein, beautifully written. So that got me going, and curiously enough, there are other books by used booksellers. In a profession that goes back as far back as there are books, booksellers have sold books in markets and stalls, out of wagons, every conceivable way booksellers have sold books. I think unfortunately nowadays books are so common they aren't valued as highly as they once were. For me, each book is like a bar of gold. And in the past, people did value them that way. Book thieves were a thing of the past. Books were chained up in libraries, they were so valuable. And today we tend to take them for granted, which is unfortunate. But let me show you some more books. Then we get into things like this. Fred Basson's diary and Fred Basson's second diary. And he was a book dealer in London, and something of a book runner as well. Now, a book runner is an interesting occupation which has almost disappeared. I think there are still people that do that. And a book runner is basically a scout, someone who is constantly searching, kind of the bottom feeders of the book trade. That is, they'll go to garage sales, thrift stores, anywhere like clearing a house or auction houses, whatever, and look for books that have been overlooked. It's not so common nowadays. Number one, prices are kind of low at that end of the market. But also, with the internet, people know immediately the value of books by researching them. So if you're going to have an estate sale, people will often research the books, find out if they're more valuable or less valuable. And so it's a little bit trickier to find unconsidered treasures. Of course, the famous ones here, like Parnassus on Wheels, wonderful book. 84 Charing Cross Road, which I thought was rather overrated. If you've ever read the book, you know that the two main characters, the woman writing the book and her recipient, an English bookseller, never actually met. But it's still a charming insight into the book world in London. Getting back to books by booksellers, you see the condition's not too good here. Typical of my books, I'm not so much on perfect condition as the actual rarity or interest of a book. But this is, let's get to the title page here. The Intimate Thoughts of John Baxter, Bookseller. So I imagine you're just immediately gripped with curiosity already. And it's exactly what it says. Another man who is a bookseller in London. And he leads off his diary, "Tonight I am going to copy out a bit from Boswell's Life of Johnson." And when you read extensively, you find more and more all books, all knowledge, all learning is interconnected. And so when you're referenced to Boswell, you read Johnson. When you read Johnson, you're related to other elements of the book trade, the intellectuals of the 18th century in London, etc. This is a particular good one. The Adventures of a Bookseller by G. Orioli. Very curious because his autobiography is much more extensive beyond just bookselling. He was a very odd character. He was Italian, lived in London for a long period of time, ended up resettling in Florence where he had a bookstore, secondhand bookstore, and he was friends, and you might say more than friends, with Norman Douglas. And it's reputed that Norman Douglas, who was a famous English novelist, wrote this as a ghostwriter for Orioli. But fascinating adventures. And this book actually gave me the idea of teaching English as a foreign language, because that was something he did extensively, including in France. It is a relatively easy job, well paid. You interact with generally more upper class people. And it's a good way to quickly jump into a job, in or out, and tutor people in their homes, and kind of stuck in my mind, and something I eventually did, as well as eventually becoming a secondhand book dealer. As I was saying, I was a student at the University of Manchester when I was 21, and that's where I acquired the bits from an old bookshop. It really wasn't until, I guess, 8 years later that I moved back to London. That is, after Manchester, I returned to the United States, and then 8 years later, I went back to London, and that's when my book collecting got a bit carried away. There were a couple of factors. One, London was an incredible area for used bookstores. I'm sure it still is, but greatly reduced as used bookstores have kind of shrunk and disappeared. But at the time, I think there were well over 100 perhaps used book dealers in greater London area, and I got to know them all. It was extremely tempting to be spending all my time in bookstores, but I was also trying to exist and make a living. And I worked as a dishwasher, I worked as a barman at a pub in Chelsea, but eventually I supported myself by selling my sketches to shops in London. I would draw a sketch on the street and then offer it to the owner of the shop. Well, I always wanted to be in bookstores, and so I sort of compromised, and I decided I'll sketch used bookstores as well and offer to sell the sketch, and if the owner is hesitant to buy it, I'll offer it in trade. And booksellers, being the gentle souls that they are, and also generally appreciating prints, artwork, many book dealers also deal in paintings and prints, they generally accept it. So I built up a collection very rapidly. I sketched almost every bookstore in London, and I am not exaggerating. And the books in my little rented room just climbed up the walls. It's a long story, Eventually, when I moved away, I sold off about half, kept about half in storage, etc., etc. But some of my favorite ones I managed to hang on to, and those are the ones that I'm showing you now. But briefly, they're reflecting very much the London book trade. I'll show you a few more here. We have, so many of these are faded, it's hard to even read the titles anymore, on the spines that is. A Bookman's Budget by Austin Dobson. So often these books would be a collection of essays on books, things like this. Byways in Bookland by Walter Russell. The Book Hunter by J.H. Burton. And then we have Andrew Lang, who wrote a series of books on books. That was kind of his forte, you might say. Books and Bookmen, Ballads of Books, Lost Leaders, all Andrew Lang. In the Name of the Bodleian by Augustine Birrell. 40 Years in My Bookshop by Spencer. This was a book I hunted for a long time. It's been rebound, obviously. Perhaps that lowers the value as an original edition. But he was a very famous London bookseller. And very difficult to find. What do I have stuck in here? Oh, a little print from the original Pickwick Papers. There's the author, an English gentleman. Again, Tales of a Bookseller. Let's see if we have some contents here. Two Kinds of Bookmen, I Launch Out as a Publisher. Robert Louis Stevenson, How He Came to Sit in My Parlor. Old Ghost from Fleet Street. A Son of Charles Dickens. But anyway, he mentions him being a publisher too, and that's something worth mentioning. Is that going back traditionally, booksellers were generally publishers, indistinguishable. There weren't many independent publishers. You can read a lot about that in Balzac. Talks a lot about that custom in France where a bookseller would privately print books. An author would come into a bookshop and offer his book to be reproduced. Also, I think Alphonse Daudet in Numa Rumastan, he talks about that. Fascinating. Things were printed in smaller editions then, probably. Distribution was a bit different and everything else. But booksellers, as I say, dabble in a lot. They were also publishers, they were also art dealers. Sometimes they even dealt with old furniture. And, well, my personal shop was kind of a mix of art, antiques, and books as well. And then what happened, I kind of tilted into London Bohemia life. But let's see, what else do I have here? The Love Affairs of a Bibliomaniac. Lovely little book. That's the thing, like English books were published in beautiful hardbacks. Let's see what we have here. 1896. The binding is good, the pages are good, quality paper. You just don't see this kind of quality paper done nowadays. This is Booksellers and Printers, Old and New, he talks about. But in France, books were generally published in their, what we would call a paperback or softback edition, and then you were meant to take them to your binder and have them rebound in nice calves or editions. But the English generally directly were printed in these nice hardbacks. What do we have here? Buying and Selling Rare Books. And by Morris Briggs, 1927. And let's see here, jumping about. And then, as I say, I got kind of interest in Bohemia, things like this. Bohemia in London, or London's Latin Quarter. Oh, things like Me as a Model. Bohemian Paris as, what, Bohemian Paris of Today. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because we're kind of dipping into a whole different category of my collection here. Um, Getting back to kind of English people, we have The Diversions of a Bookworm by J. Rogers Rees, 1886. A Primer of Book Collecting by Winterich. Here's a nice little book. Round and About the Bookstalls. A Guide for the Book Hunter by J. Herbert Slater, London, 1891. Rough Diamonds, Unconsidered Trifles. The Modern Book Hunter. Of course, The Modern Book Hunter, 1896, a little bit different than now, perhaps. When I was a book dealer, it surprised me which books were more collectible or more highly sought after than others. I have my personal biases, of course, but I was amazed how books on religion and cookbooks and Arctic exploration and topics that I really hadn't considered were extremely popular. And of course, as a bookseller, you have to adapt to what the public wants. Now I'd like to show you a few books closer up. As I was describing my life in London at that time, this is also part of that collection I built up then. Here we have a 2-volume set. They're identical, but it's the London Bookshop and London Bookshop Part 2. And what it is, not for sale at the time, are black and white photos of all of the famous used booksellers at that time in London. And what do we have here? 1971. So, as you see, wonderful black and white photos, and for any book lover, I'm sure licking your lips at the sight of these bookshops. Some of these very famous. Bertram Rhoda, extremely famous, some of the most famous booksellers in the world. And then other smaller shops like here at Cecil Court. H.M. Fletcher, 27 Cecil Court. Now if you're a serious book lover and you manage to get to Europe and manage to get to London, you know you go straight to Cecil Court. That is a bookseller's row. It's a pedestrian passage between two streets there. I'm trying to think. I think one is Charing Cross, is it? And what's the other street on the other side? I'm not sure. But anyway, it's a pedestrian passageway, and all the shops are uniform with these beautiful glass storefronts. And it's just a magical street. It's not 100% booksellers. It kind of varies. Things come and go. But probably, I don't know, 60, 70% booksellers. I haven't been there recently. But it is a bit of a vanishing world. Let's see, this is a corner up here on Charing Cross Road. Charing Cross Road, when I was a student, back when I was 19, Charing Cross Road had kind of bookshops all up and down. But those 8 or 9 years later, when I'm back to live in London, most of them were gone. Foyles was still there, a very famous bookstore. Now, this was a volume, Bibliopola, Siegfried Taubert. This is volume 2, and here we have volume 1. I first saw this in London, and it was too expensive for me. And since then, I managed to order a copy. And what we have are illustrations of the book trade. All illustrations of books, booksellers. I'm not sure. Let's see how well you can see these. Bookshops, booksellers. Some are in color. Absolutely beautiful lithographs. Bookstore, woodcut. And when I first saw this, I wanted it so badly, way out of my price range, but as time goes on, sometimes our wishes come true. What do we have here? Utamaro, who really specialize in courtesans, but this is a triptych showing booksellers and the production of books. Beautiful. And then the other volume I think is more of the same, and I'm not sure why one is so thick and one is so thin. This seems to be more reference on the individual artworks. It's in English and German. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about another portion of my life. And after living in London, I ended up living in Paris. And in Paris, I had the somewhat amazing, I wouldn't quite say unique, but rare experience of living in a bookstore, and that is the famous one, Shakespeare and Company. This is a photo of Shakespeare and Company there in Paris. As you may know, the original Shakespeare and Company was on Rue de l'Odéon, ran by Sylvia Beach, and that's where Ernest Hemingway hung out, and she printed the first edition of Ulysses by James Joyce, etc. But George Whitman opened up Shakespeare and Company there across from Notre Dame, and with permission from Sylvia Beach, he kept that name Shakespeare and Company. And they had a reputation for taking in writers, sometimes just bums off the street, and putting them up for a night, weeks, months. There's a lot of stories. But I lived in a room upstairs, right here. As a matter of fact, I'll show you something here. And this was the actual bed that I slept in. For somebody else, it looked pretty bad, maybe. But look at that, surrounded by books. So who could ask for more? It was a very interesting time. Crazy, crazy times. And then not long ago, I found this. Books, Baguettes, and Bedbugs. The Left Bank World of Shakespeare and Company by Jeremy Mercer. I think this is the American edition, and the French or the English edition had a different title. Trying to think now what the original title was. Sorry, I don't see it right here, but I know it is also known under a different title. But anyway, Jeremy Mercer had a very similar experience to myself. Now, I lived at Shakespeare and Company in 1981, and I think this book was sometime in the early 90s, maybe. Let's see. Oh, first published 2005. Okay. But his experience was very similar. One of the common things he talked about was going to Polly Magoo's, which is a famous bar around the corner. Now, Polly Magoo's has changed a lot too, and the last time I was in Paris, it had become a tea salon. Not at all what it once was. Became famous in the 1960s, the little mini revolution in 1968 in Paris. And a lot of these radicals would meet at Polly Magoo's, and it was a bizarre place of the most mixed people you can imagine on the face of the earth. And very dark, open all night, loud music, crazy people, drugs, everything you could imagine went on there. And it was right around the corner from Shakespeare and Company, and Jeremy mentions that quite a bit going there. But his book is largely about the reconciliation of the owner, George Whitman, who I knew, and his daughter, who was estranged and lived in London. And he brought about a reconciliation. George Whitman died, in his 90s. It's been about 5 or 6 years now, I guess. And his daughter moved from London to Paris and took over the bookstore. And I was there not long ago. Glad to see it's still there. It's much cleaner and more proper and better run on a business, but it's lost a lot of the charm. George was a very bizarre character, and he's famous for cutting his hair by burning it off with a candle. He would have poetry readings on the weekend. He'd have his afternoon tea on Sunday. I attended often with different writers and people. Very odd person. I can't go into too much now, but the current edition of Shakespeare and Company, as I say, is much better run. They actually own a little coffee shop next door. I'm not sure about housing people anymore, but here's a book I recently acquired, and it's a fairly new book. Shakespeare and Company, A History of the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. And this is a wonderful book. I'm rather cynical about people who profit off things that I love. And there's so many books written about Paris, and I'm kind of resentful of Americans going over there and thinking they know the secret Paris, and they write about it, and it just doesn't work. But this is an interesting book. It's very, very well done. There's my book plate that I put in. But it combines a bunch of samples of these autobiographies. You see, one of the things you had to do living there was write an autobiography. And there was always talk about publishing them together and putting them together, and I'm not quite sure if that came together. But there are many excerpts, and they're absolutely fascinating, the wide variety of people who came to Paris, who lived at Shakespeare and Company, and they're different stories, everything from being runaways to being book fanatics, and maybe a little bit of both. And it's a history of the bookstore, great photos over the years. It's really well put together. It's really charming. It's something so unique, a business like this that was barely a business, but a wonderful book. Actually, I think that's the same bed that I slept in there. It looks different here. This is the reading room. I confess to smuggling a few books out of the reading room, but I also spent many a cold, rainy day there drawing inside. I don't want to go on and show you every single book in my collection. Some are more interesting than others, obviously, in this particular section. I'll just show you a few quick more. Again, kind of going from my English days, this is a more recent book, Diary of a Bookseller. It was entertaining, curious fellow, independent, a bit cranky he sounds, sort of a diary through 1 year in the life of a bookseller. Now what happens with this fellow is that he's a more contemporary person. When I'm talking about these other people, book selling was quite a bit different. And the major change, obviously, has been the internet. And the internet is largely responsible for killing off small booksellers. Many have managed to survive by combining what's called a brick and mortar store, that is where people are going to come in, and selling online. Now the problem with that, as all of you know, is you got to spend a lot of time to post every single book online, keep track of them when they sell, ship them out, etc. Much more complicated than somebody simply walking into your shop. But Sean Bithnell, or Bithell, I guess you would pronounce his name, is managing to do that by a hair's breadth. Interesting book as someone trying to adapt and survive in this modern world of book selling. Oh, here's another one I liked a lot too. The Memoirs of an Erotic Bookseller by Armand Coppens. And it's not a dirty book per se. It's not written about salacious material. It's what it says. It's about his life as a bookseller, and he specialized in erotic books. And of course he has some funny stories about some of the odd collectors that he knew as well. But it's a very good read. You have things like Books in My Baggage by Lawrence Powell, who was the friend of Henry Miller and worked at the UCLA library. And then you have things like this, The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which was an interesting story about these people who had held in secret all of these manuscripts from the Middle Ages that were being destroyed by radical extremists, religious extremists, and their effort to save these manuscripts, who were very, very rare, illustrated manuscripts. And it's a very, very good read, interesting book. And you have things like, well, rare books uncovered, the same kind of an idea about finding rare books. Well, here's one I just read recently. Larry McMurtry, you've probably heard of course, wrote Lonesome Dove and other books, and he was trying to turn his hometown into one of these book cities where the entire town was taken up with bookstores, and he somewhat succeeded, but the town, I think, is just so isolated, is the biggest problem in Texas. And not too long ago, I don't know, I think about 4 years ago, he sold off most of the books in all of these bookstores and kept one smaller one himself. But speaking of particular areas of interest within a collection, his favorite collection are books by women explorers and women in early adventure circumstances. I have things like by women writers, My Life Among the Sioux Indians, women who were kidnapped by Native Americans here. And that's his specialty of all things. Very proud of. He has a big collection of them. Fascinating. But let's see. Quickly, anything else here I want to pop out? Diversions of a Bookworm, Primer of Book Collecting, The Library at Night. Oh, this is a nice little one here. The Yellow Lighted Bookshop. He's a San Francisco writer, Louis Busby. Very, very nice book. Wonderfully printed. Let's see, who is the printer of this? Grey Wolf Press, St. Paul, Minnesota. Beautiful paper, really, really nice edges. And then you have things like books, their history, etc., making of books, and the art of the bookstore, all paintings of bookstores. What else was I looking at here? Book Row, The Library at Night, The Book on the Bookshelf. This Henry Petrosky is an interesting writer. I haven't read this one yet. I read another book by him called The Pencil. But he is very, very slow and meticulous on dissecting a subject, and I'm sure this one's going to be good. Well, I guess that gives you enough to see all of them have their own story, and they have their moments in my life. Kind of a guilty pleasure book collecting, but I'm sure if you're watching this, you know what I mean.